The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, we find ourselves in another position like we found ourselves in before. We find ourselves in a position in which the government spending authority is set to expire in just a few hours. We've known this was coming for weeks, just like we did with the last continuing resolution, and the one before that, and the one before that. As undersea world Jacques Cousteau once observed, we're living in an interminable succession of absurdities imposed by the myopic logic of short-term thinking. Every time we approach this as if it were somehow going to be different this time. We quibble from time to time about this or that policy. We quibble from time to time about the price tag. Sometimes we're so focused on the policy and the price tag that we forget about the process. And it's primarily to this subject, the process, that I'd like to turn my attention for the next few minutes. You see, the process is important around here. We come from different backgrounds. We come from different states representing diverse interests across this great country. We're not going to agree on everything. In fact, there are a lot of things on which we strongly disagree. And that's why we have processes. The Constitution is itself all about the process. In fact, the Constitution is more or less agnostic as to the substantive policy outcome. It's all about connecting the American people to their government that's there to serve them. It's all about making sure that there is responsiveness and accountability from the government to the people, to make sure that the government serves the people and not the other way around. And so it's for this reason, it's very important that each member who holds an election certificate in this body, or in the body just down the hall from us in the House of Representatives, is allowed to express his or her opinions and have them matter. Nowhere is this more important, Mr. President, than when it comes to spending bills. You see, it's spending bills where we have the opportunity to exercise oversight over the federal government, a government that requires the American people to spend many months out of every year working just to pay their tax bills, a federal government that imposes $2 trillion every single year in regulatory compliance costs on the American people, a government that has the power to destroy a business or a livelihood, or in some cases, lives. It's important that we exercise this oversight, and without spending constraints, there can be no meaningful oversight. Without an adequate process, the Republican form of government cannot fulfill its role. The American people are no longer in charge of their government when this happens. For this reason, it's a little disturbing that a government that spends nearly $4 trillion every single year makes its spending decisions in one fell swoop, as it does. You see, whenever we pass a continuing resolution, what we're doing effectively as a Congress is pressing a reset button that keeps current spending levels intact, in place, unchanged, as if there were no reviewing body, as if there had been no elections, as if the American people didn't matter at all to the process by which they're governed. This is an abdication of our role as the people's elected representatives. This disconnects the American people. And we wonder, Mr. President, why it is that this is an institution, Congress, that enjoys an approval rating somewhere between 9 and 14%, making us slightly less popular than Fidel and Raul Castro in America, and only slightly more popular than the influenza virus, which is rapidly gaining on us. It is for this reason, because we've disconnected the American people from their own government. And one of the ways in which we do that is when we pass a continuing resolution to keep the government funded at current levels without any additional changes. And when these things are offered, often within just hours of the expiration of a spending deadline. So we've got a bill before us. It's quite lengthy, that we've had access to for only about 24 hours, a little bit less than that. And we're asked to make a binary choice as to that legislation, yes or no. Vote for it, and in this case, there are some things that you get. You get $90 billion in emergency spending. You get an increase of spending caps of about $300 billion over 2 years. You get in excess of $1 trillion in new debt. Some have estimated it could be more like $1.5 trillion, but we'll be talking about a $22 trillion debt by the second quarter of 2019 as a result of this bill. And we are told when we receive this bill, you've got two options. You can vote yes and accept all of those things, or you can vote no. And there's no opportunity for anything in between there. No opportunity to amend it, no opportunity to improve it. And if you think about it, Mr. President, there's not really a meaningful opportunity for debate if you don't have a meaningful opportunity to amend a legislative provision once it's introduced. And so members are told over and over and over again, you've either got to vote for this and accept the government as is with no changes, or with changes that you might find incredibly disturbing, or you'll be blamed for a shutdown. Why is this okay? Now, one of the things that we hear from the American people, quite understandably, quite justifiably, is why can't you just all get into a room and come to an agreement? Well, this is that room. There are two such rooms here in the Capitol. One is in the Senate, one is in the House of Representatives. This is the room where that's supposed to take place. There are mechanisms by which that's supposed to occur through the amendment process. People offer up legislation, they offer to improve legislation. If they have concerns with it, they can offer up amendments. When members are denied that opportunity, the American people are disconnected yet again from that process. Who benefits from this? Well, it certainly isn't the American people, who find that their government gets bigger and more expensive. It does so at their expense, at the American people's expense. And every time we undertake this process again, we pass another continuing resolution, we suggest that it's somehow okay to fund the government this way, with one decision affecting every aspect of government in one vote, put forward under sort of extortive circumstances in which members are told, you've either got to do this or the government's going to shut down. And you will be blamed for that if you vote against it. This isn't right. Why couldn't we bring legislation to the floor, not hours, but weeks or even months before the deadline? Why couldn't we allow that to occur, to allow the debate, the discussion to occur under the light of day, rather than having this legislation negotiated under cover of darkness, behind closed doors, where the American people are left out? I've thought about this on many occasions, and how there are very few circumstances in our day-to-day lives that are like the way Congress spends money. It's occurred to me that if you moved into a new area, a very remote area, and you had access to only one grocery store for many, many miles, for many, many hours, and you were on your way home from work, your spouse called you and said, stop at the store, pick up bread, milk, and eggs. And so you go to the store and you get your grocery cart, and you go to the bread aisle and you put a loaf of bread in your cart, and a carton of milk, and a dozen eggs. And you get to the checkout counter and you put out your bread and your milk and your eggs. And the cashier rings those things up and says, I'm sorry, you may not purchase bread, milk, and eggs unless you also purchase a half ton of iron ore and a bucket of nails and a book about cowboy poetry and a Barry Manilow album. In fact, this is a special kind of store where you have to buy all of those things. And in fact, you have to buy one of every item in this entire store in order to buy any of these things, including the bread, the milk, and the eggs. Well, that would start to approximate what it feels like to spend money in Congress, where we're told you can't fund any part of government unless you're willing to fund all of government, subject to such changes as the few people who write the continuing resolution might insert. And you, by the way, having been duly elected by the citizens of your state, will be left out of the process other than to exercise the binary choice of yes or no. And so, Mr. President, we've seen that this is how we get to be $20 trillion in debt, soon to be $22 trillion in debt. We don't get to be $20 trillion, soon to be $22 trillion in debt, without a whole lot of agreement on the part of a whole lot of people to do that. It's a bipartisan exercise, to be sure. Bipartisanship is necessary, but the fact that it's bipartisan doesn't always make it holy. You don't get to be $20 trillion in debt without a whole lot of Republicans agreeing with a whole lot of Democrats that we're going to do precisely that. It might inure to the benefit of a few people who stand to benefit every time the government gets bigger or more expensive, every time we do things this way, but it hurts everyone else. The process matters. The fact is, we will not always come to an agreement as to how much we ought to spend. We will not always come to an agreement as to those things on which we will be spending the requisite amount of money. But I think we should be able to agree that the American people deserve a process, one that allows them to be heard through the people's own elected representatives. If not us, who? If not now, when? At what point are we going to start appropriating funds through this government, through a process that's open, that's transparent, that can be observed by the American people, and through which the American people can be heard? At the end of the day, we must remember that we are great as a country, not because of who we are, but because of what we do. To the extent that we've recognized as a nation that the dignity of the human soul matters, that the rights of the individual have to be taken into account, and that the government works for the people, we have prospered and will prosper in the future. But we have to be willing to respect the American people, and we should not be surprised when we ignore them over and over again, when we shut them out of a process that directly and materially impacts their lives. We should not be shocked when they respond with horror. We shouldn't be surprised when wave election after wave election signals dissatisfaction with this very body, with this very entity that serves as the legislative branch of our federal government. So each time we're presented with one of these continuing resolutions, or with a one-size-fits-all spending package, where we're told you've got to either vote for it and all of it with no opportunity to improve it, or you've got to vote against it, I have concerns with that. I've got significant concerns with this particular legislation, and I will vote no. Thank you, Mr. President.